Geopolitical tensions are rising, and today we will discuss the implications of this as World War III looms overhead. You came here for the truth, so let me unveil that for you. Russia says the ruble crisis over as reserves dive and inflation climbs. This article is out of Reuters. If we fast forward down into the article, they said that its currency crisis was over even though its forex reserves have plunged and annual inflation has climbed above 10%. So we'll discuss that in a moment here. Just wanted to say that they are facing a big problem. This is definitely the worst they've had since 1998, but they put some steps in place in order to really stop the damage that was occurred. The ruble plunged to all-time lows, and this is partly because of what happened with oil. Definitely any oil exporting nation is going to be hurt by the price dropping so dramatically in a relatively short period of time. And we also go into what has happened with the Ukraine. We're going to connect that in a moment. But what they've done with the Ukraine, with the sanctions, has also led to these ruble plunges. But it has since rebounded sharply after authorities took steps to halt its slide and bring down inflation. One of the most important things that they did was the increase in the interest rates. In fact, they brought the interest rates up to 17%. Now, in a historical context, we saw in 1980 Paul Volcker bring the U.S. interest rates up to 20% approximately. So we saw what happened there, and that was able to really stop the heating up of the inflation rates there, and it is all being done by the manipulation of the interest rates. So this is what they've did. They also did a few other things, and let's get into what those are. Let's talk about Ukraine right now for a moment. Ukraine suspends trains to Crimea, citing security concerns as electricity begins to be rationed. So we'll get into this just in a moment here. What I wanted to discuss was what happened with the Ukraine, with Crimea. So essentially, for those who don't know, previously, all of this geopolitical tension came from the Ukraine and Russia, where we had the issue of Crimea being annexed by Russia. And this is obviously a concern for sovereignty of nations, and it is a bigger concern to the EU because they want to gobble up more states and have them under their control. So obviously, if Russia is going to get bigger, they are definitely going to be on the opposing side. So there are definitely two factions that have been formed here, two different sides. Ukraine's state rail company has suspended passenger and cargo train services to the Black Sea Peninsula of Crimea due to security concerns. What I wanted to talk about was that during the Soviet era, we saw food and other necessities being cut off to areas, causing massive famines. We saw the death spiral that occurs because of the cutting off of the resources. This could happen to any place in the world, but I'm just noting it right here, right now, that there is a crisis occurring right here in Crimea. It is still going on today. The geopolitical tensions are definitely rising. This right here is Crimea, and you can see that the only thing lit up is the cars going down the streets. The power is out, and people are definitely going to be in trouble. People are generally not prepared, of course, particularly in the Western nations, where people are too used to having everything up and running. They're having, the government always there to backstop anything that ever happens, whether that's the FDIC insuring your money in the banks, or whether that's if a natural disaster happens during, for example, Hurricane Katrina. Will the FEMA be there to help everyone? We all know what happened with that. Let's move on to Belarus. They are having a very, very big problem right now with inflation rates. Their currency is being destroyed, and they are imposing capital controls, wage controls, price controls out of every which way. And right here, Belarusian President Lukashenko said that the state control over the prices will remain in place in the republic and urged businesses not to count on liberalization of the price policy. And they go on. And he said this: "I want to say that the trend towards control over domestic prices will remain forever. This is the kind of thing that we will see when more and more countries begin to suffer. Instead of allowing the market to crash, instead of allowing the market to basically go back to a realistic level, they step in and they make worse and worse decisions. Then the worst part is when we have big businesses colluding with the government to make those decisions. That's when we really have the biggest problem. And we know specifically that this has been going on. Just look at the financial crisis. When we had a crisis occurring, they turned to the very people that caused the crisis in the first place, and then it gets worse and worse, and you see the pockets of these CEOs and of the executives of these corporations getting more and more full while the people are being hurt. Let's look at what I wrote about in my book very briefly. They said the American prosperity was caused by the payment of high wages instead of the other way around. The fact is that a high wage is the result of hard work and income earned over years, not a handout from the government. And that just connects into what I was just saying, how basically wages are determined by their value in the market. If a person cannot afford to pay a particular employee a certain wage, they will simply not hire them. It's not as if they're going to continue to hire them and just take less profit. Corporations are worried about their profit first and foremost, and that's just the way it is. So the government likes to subsidize a lot of these industries, and that just takes money away from people through taxation, and it funnels it into less productive means. That's what's happening right here when you have things like capital controls. They're not putting the restrictions on the mega corporations. They're putting the restrictions on the individual citizen. And that's the problem. That's what I see whenever a government tends to make a decision. For the most part, of course, they are definitely not making that with the people in mind. This is out of Bloomberg. China extends forwards swaps to trading to 3 more currencies. So as we have this geopolitical tension, we are going to have really the two sides forming. And we see how China has definitely been buddying up to Russia right now. And it's not just Russia. In fact, it is Malaysia, New Zealand, as well as Russia. So we see them having this trade with the yuan, and you know that they do not want to have to use the US dollar if their currencies are affected by a currency crisis, by any sort of geopolitical tension that is occurring. They can transfer their own currencies between each other so they don't lose on having to use the reserve currency, which is currently the US dollar. So doesn't it make more sense for them to do trade in between each other? And let's say they have been brought down significantly, but at least on a whole, they were brought down together. So their currencies in between each other are going to be relatively stable. So that's what they're doing, and they're going away from the US dollar and the reserve currency status. Once again, as I've said 100 times before, not something that happens overnight, but it is definitely occurring right now. And all of this chaos that is occurring is only going to make this snowball even quicker. There's much more in this article here, and you know where I'm going with it, so I would just move on quickly. And we're going to talk about Japan. This is one nation that has definitely been intervening in the markets for decades, and this is what happens when you print up trillions of dollars or trillions of yuan, and you have this. The savings rate in the year through March was minus 1.3%, the first negative reading in data back to 1955. So we're looking at an actual negative savings rate. They're looking a lot like what's happening in the US. Real earnings fell 4.3% in November from a year earlier, a 17th straight decline and the steepest tumble since 2009. We see that the policies that they put in place don't work. This is very evident. They're printing a record amount of currency, putting it into the banking system, and yet you see the people saving in a negative format, so they're going to obviously be hurt there. And then you have real earnings hurting them as well, going down. This is what's happening to the US and in areas in the Europe and as well as anywhere in the world essentially, but you have real wages declining. So let's get into that right here. Japan wages, nominal versus real wage growth, and you could see the steepest stumbles occurring right now. All of their policies that they put in place are just hurting the saver. They're hurting the individual. They can only continue this for so long. What's going to happen is these pension funds that people are really waiting on and needing and desiring are going to be hurt, because inflation is going to wipe them out, or deflation, or we will have some sort of levy, a tax, or some other method that they choose. Regardless, we know that they are the ones causing the problem. They collude with the big bankers in order to have this take place. If you found this video informative, please give me a thumbs up, and don't forget to become an insider. The Insiders is where I give out all my best intel for free, and that is available at themoneygps.com. Scroll down to the bottom, fill in your email address, and you get occasional emails from me with good, short, concise info.